Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is from chapter 327. Chapter 327. It would be difficult to explain why and whither ants, whose heap has been destroyed, are hurrying. Some from the heap, dragging bits of rubbish, larvae, and corpses. Others back to the heap, or why they jostle, overtake one another, and fight. And it would be equally difficult to explain what caused the Russians, after the departure of the French, to throng to the place that had formerly been Moscow. But when we watch the ants around their ruined heap, the tenacity, energy, and immense number of the delving insects prove that despite the destruction of the heap, something indestructible, which, though intangible, is the real strength of the colony, still exists. And similarly, though in Moscow in the month of October there was no government and no churches, shrines, riches, or houses, it was still the Moscow it had been in August. All was destroyed, except something intangible, yet powerful and indestructible. The motives of those who thronged from all sides to Moscow after it had been cleared of the enemy were most diverse and personal, and at first, for the most part, savage and brutal. One motive only they all had in common, a desire to get to the place that had been called Moscow, to apply their activities there. Within a week, Moscow already had 15,000 inhabitants, in a fortnight 25,000, and so on. By the autumn of 1813, the number, ever increasing and increasing, exceeded what it had been in 1812. The first Russians to enter Moscow were the Cossacks of Wensegrod's detachment, peasants from the adjacent villages, and residents who had fled from Moscow and had been hiding in its vicinity. The Russians who entered Moscow, finding it plundered it in their turn. They continued what the French had begun. Trains of peasant carts came to Moscow to carry off to the villages what had been abandoned in the ruined houses and on the streets. The Cossacks carried off what they could to their camps, and the householders seized all they could find in other houses and moved it into their own, pretending that it was their property. But the first plunderers were followed by a second and a third contingent, and with increasing numbers, plundering became more and more difficult and assumed more definite forms. The French found Moscow abandoned, but with all the organizations of regular life, with diverse branches of commerce and craftsmanship, with luxury and governmental and religious institutions. These forms were lifeless, but still existed. There were bazaars, shops, warehouses, market stalls, granaries. For the most part, these were still stocked with goods. And there were factories and workshops, palaces and wealthy houses filled with luxuries, hospitals, prisons, government offices, churches, and cathedrals. The longer the French remained, the more these forms of town life perished, until finally all was merged into one confused, lifeless scene of plunder. The more the plundering by the French continued, the more both the wealth of Moscow and the strength of its plunderers were destroyed. But plundering by the Russians, with which the reoccupation of the city began, had the opposite effect. The longer it continued, and the greater the number of people taking part in it, the more rapidly the wealth of the city and its regular life restored. Besides the plunderers, very various people, some drawn by curiosity, some by official duties, some by self-interest, house owners, clergy, officials of all kinds, tradesmen, artisans, and peasants, streamed into Moscow, as blood flows to the heart. Within a week, the peasants who came with empty carts to carry off plunder were stopped by the authorities and made to cart the corpses out of town. Other peasants, having heard of their comrades' discomfiture, came to town bringing rye, oats, and hay, and beat down one another's prices to below what they had formerly been in former days. Gangs of carpenters hoping for high pay arrived in Moscow every day, and on all sides logs were being hewn, new houses built, and old charred ones repaired. Tradesmen began trading in booths. Cookshops and taverns were opened in partially burned houses. The clergy resumed the services in many churches that had not been burned. Donors contributed church property that had been stolen. Government clerks set up their baize-covered tables with their pigeonholes of documents in small rooms. The higher authorities and the police organized the distribution of goods left behind by the French. The owners of houses in which much property had been left, brought there from other houses, complained of the injustice of taking everything to the faceted palace in the Kremlin. Others insisted that as the French had gathered things from different houses into this or that house, it would be unfair to allow its owner to keep all that was found there. They abused the police and bribed them, made out estimates at 10 times their value for government stores that had perished in the fire, and demanded relief. And Count Rasputin wrote proclamations. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 327 of War and Peace. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, day 327. Magic and where to find it. Clifford Smith, Shaolin poet extraordinaire, reflecting on the impenetrable logic of spontaneous order, writes that we should, quote, recognize the gods came for one accord, one mind and one common cause. That's the shit, son. End quote. Here, Smith marvels at the unorchestrated, self-organized emergence of various phenomena: biological processes, language, law, natural selection. What most fascinates Smith is the presence of unity in the absence of a unifier. Tolstoy shares Smith's fascination with the subject of spontaneous order. In today's chapter, his subject is the reconstruction of Moscow. Tolstoy writes, "The motives of those who thronged from all sides to Moscow after it had been cleared of the enemy were most diverse and personal, and at first, for the most part, savage and brutal. They all had only one motive in common, a desire to get to the place that had been called Moscow, to apply their activities there." The undirected coordination of human action is a major theme of Tolstoy's theory of history. We've discussed it before. He returns to the subject today, noting the decentralized nature of Moscow's rebuilding. He begins by noting that the French destruction of Moscow left it with no government and no churches, shrines, riches, or houses. What remains, however, is something intangible, yet powerful and indestructible. This mysterious power is spontaneous order, and it works its unknowable magic as Moscow slowly but surely rebuilds itself. No one directs the peasants to enter Moscow and haul out all the ruins. They just do it. When the authorities command the peasants to use their empty carts to haul off corpses instead of plunder, other peasants respond by bringing their comrades rye, oats, and hay. This has the unintended consequence of beating down prices to a level not seen before the occupation. So much of Moscow's rehabilitation is just like this: the emergence of order through the interplay of uncoordinated human action. Though top-down command does play a role, its part is very limited in the process. This is an important point to keep in mind. Soon, we'll transition into the part of the novel where Tolstoy abandons his fictional narrative and commits to a historical analysis exclusively. A major part of his analysis relies on the bottom-up, self-organized property of history. Daily Meditation. Order's everywhere, yet we humans too create it. It emerges, no one intends it, no one has to orchestrate it. It's the product of our actions, but no single mind's designed it. There's magic without wizards, if you just know how to find it. Russ Roberts, It's a Wonderful Loaf. All right, that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 327. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation to PayPal. The links to all that are down below in the show notes. Also, down in the show notes or the description, you'll find links to my Amazon wishlist for books and movies. If you decide to support me by purchasing one of those, we'll set up a Zoom call or something to discuss that book or that movie. And that'll be fun. Tomorrow, we're going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 328 of War and Peace. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.